minister in the early 1880s, noted that Chicago was the only city of its size in the world, with not a single structure built by local benevolence. It was so dirty and barren of culture that no one vacationed there. In the decade after Haymarket, the sons of Chicago's business elite showed the world their city was about more than bomb throwers and pig stickers. They built cultural institutions that would uplift the city as churches uplifted the neighborhoods. In 1887, Charles Hutchinson, son of a pork packer, opened the Art Institute. He rushed to Tuscany to snap up a Rembrandt and other treasures from a widowed princess. He probably paid $1,000 a foot for his Rubenses, Rembrandts, and Van Dycks, New York reporters scoffed, and will be led on a float through the streets by a team of milk-white Berkshire hogs. "We have made our money in pigs," Hutchinson retorted. "Is that any reason we should not spend it on paintings?" Hutchinson wanted to raise the cultural level of hard-driving businessmen, like his father, who he said were in a state of slavery, mere machines devoted to business. His father was dismayed.
Charles Hutchinson bought a French painting of a sheep meadow, a pastoral scene, and his father looked at it and he said, "Think of it. My son paid $500 a piece for 5 sheep when I could have bought each one of them live for $2 a head."
Charles Hutchinson was another who believed in the refining power of beauty.
No modernist carries around this notion of art, but in this period, art was meant to elevate, to refine. The word refine was a very clear metaphor for what they wanted in the human self. The body was filled with all sorts of urges and desires and material wishes. And you take that dross and you take it through the prism of art and you refine that into a more elevated self.
By the early 20th century, the Art Institute was drawing more visitors than Boston's Museum of Fine Arts or New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. It charged no admission on Sundays, the working man's day off. One regular visitor was a Polish immigrant from Packingtown. "We have built this institution for the public, not for a few," Hutchinson said. "We want the people of Chicago to feel it is their property."
Did people give to the art museum or support the public library movement to provide distraction, to avoid concentration on the economic differences which separated the haves or have-nots? Were these instruments of social control, or were they instruments actually of inspirational uplift? Historians have spilled a lot of ink on these questions. Uplift had at its center, I think, the notion that institutions could improve the spiritual welfare of the population as a whole.
Another who tried to improve the welfare of the people was Montgomery Ward. He looked down from his towering mail-order headquarters on Michigan Avenue and saw Grant Park and a waterfront despoiled by the Illinois Central tracks. Battling developers who valued the land, Ward led a 13-year campaign to enforce the decision made in 1836 that the lakefront remain forever open, free of any buildings or obstruction. He even opposed Marshall Field for wanting to build a museum in the park. "I fought for the poor people," he said, "not the millionaires."
He had to fight everyone. The Tribune, a powerful newspaper in the 19th century, was against him. The other owners on Michigan Avenue were against him. He had very little support. The Field family threatened not to give money for the Field Museum if he prevailed. But he kept on to save the lakefront for Chicago. And finally, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld him.
The Field family agreed to build a museum of natural history, one of the landmarks on Chicago's lakefront, south of Grant Park. The park remains forever open, free of any obstruction. In November 1889, Chicago unveiled a new music hall, the Auditorium Theater. Bankrolled by businessmen rallied by Ferdinand Peck, it was the first major commission for Louis Sullivan, the young partner of an established acoustical engineer.
Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan were given the job to do it. Why? Not because of Sullivan, but because they knew that Dankmar Adler could give them the best possible theater. Sullivan just kind of came along as part of the package.
Like the poet Walt Whitman, whom he admired, Sullivan was obsessed with the idea of democracy.
One of Sullivan's notions about the auditorium was that it was democratic because it didn't have the boxes that the European opera houses did. The purchase of a box and the presence in a certain box of the wealthy was part of the opera ritual.
The old concert halls were hierarchical, one box and top, and then the kings and queens sat at one, and all boxes was separated by class. The auditorium was democratic. You could see from every seat. You could hear from every seat. Caruso sang this, and you could hear a pin drop. That was the auditorium.
When the theater first opened up, there was going to be a special concert for the working people of Chicago. And someone on the auditorium board had suggested that they should put some kind of covering over the seats so that the workmen's dirty clothing would not soil the seats. And there's stories of Ferdinand Peck stomping his foot and saying no, that if you can cover them with anything, he would cover them with even finer velvets that were on there. And I think this kind of gives you an idea of the democratic ideals that were very much a part of the auditorium project.
At the opening banquet, the mayor praised the businessmen who had backed it, not for money, but for public spirit, for the honor and glory of their city. In a city of talented, music-loving Germans, the Chicago Symphony, which performed in the Auditorium Theater, never advertised in German-language newspapers. The democratic ideals had their limits. The theater was part of the Auditorium building, at the time the largest building in the world, the tallest structure in North America. To help pay for the theater, it included a hotel and an office building.
The idea that the tallest building should be in Chicago rather than in New York is something that for them it's physical, you can't argue with it. So that if you have a great orchestra or great artists and Eastern critics are dismissive, then, well, how are you going to argue back and forth? Maybe they know more or whatever. But the building is there, and by golly, you can't argue with something physical. And I think that obsession with architecture really has to do with the city's desire to be a world-class city.
The men who built the auditorium building featured it in an ad in Harper's in 1889 as they made their case for Chicago as the site for the 1892 World's Fair. They also trumpeted their stockyards.
This was the 400th anniversary of the Columbian voyage. Columbus didn't get to Chicago, although you wouldn't have known that from the way Chicagoans talked.
The men who have helped build Chicago want this fair, their resolution read, and they intend to get it.
And their argument was the center of gravity in the country, power and population, is shifting gradually to the Midwest. And a train ride from New York to Chicago is a train ride through the heart of the country, and you can see America. You just come into New York, you won't see America. It's also, they said, a train ride into the future, because you'll see the city of the future, a city built completely from scratch, from the ground up.
In 2.5 years, Frederick Law Olmsted, America's most famous landscape architect, working with architects Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root, converted a swamp on the shore of Lake Michigan into an American Venice, with interlinked canals, basins, and lagoons. It was the most gigantic landscape scheme ever attempted in the country. It is safe to say, the Hartford Courant reported, that no other community in all history except the Chicago community could have done it. In no other city is there the requisite public spirit, generosity, and headlong energy. The opening ball was held on time in the Auditorium Theater in October 1892. Harriet Pullman organized the dancing lessons. George went through the motions. He once wrote his daughter Florence, "You provide the sort of family happiness I don't get from your mother." Marshall Field could give the lady what she wants at work, not at night. He was on the verge of a divorce. Philip Armour was up way past his bedtime. Hostess Bertha Palmer featured a gown of yellow satin with puffs of velvet from Worth's in Paris. Potter tagged along. There were no sightings of Gustavus Swift. He may have been inspecting the sewer at Bubbly Creek. The Prairie Avenue crowd took its dancing lessons at Bournique's on 23rd Street. General Phil Sheridan advanced with military single-mindedness and stepped on my toes, one partner sighed, and did not reverse until I was dizzy. This elite group controlled Chicago's commerce, its culture. Now the fair. The world would descend on their city in May. They had time to regain control of its politics. Tribune editor Joseph Medill would see to that. It meant defeating Carter Harrison in his bid for a 5th term as mayor. Harrison, who put on Polish costumes for Polish festivals, who accepted the neighborhoods in all their unruliness. Harrison, who tolerated gambling and prostitution, who supported labor unions, who had even allowed the anarchists to rally.
And Medill is just hammering away at him in the press. He's on his editors all the time. Get this guy, even though he respected him in private, but get him. And it's easily the most vituperative campaign in Chicago history. They went at him hammer and tong, and mostly on the anarchist issue. He's the guy who led a march in the streets. He's the guy who encouraged the 8-hour day. He's the guy who encouraged the violence and testified at the Haymarket case that there was no violence when he left the Haymarket Square.
The businessmen ran one of their own, Samuel Allerton, a millionaire porkpacker.
He says, I am a businessman, not a politician. Medill says, fine, we'll push him as a businessman. This is a business city. It's the second largest corporation in the country, he said. New York's the first. And this guy will run it like a business corporation with efficiency and a land and leadership.
The Tribune and the businessmen could not match Harrison's support in the ethnic neighborhoods. Carter Henry Harrison won the battle for the soul of Chicago by the largest margin of his 5 campaigns. The celebration in neighborhood saloons lasted all night. It was then that Bathhouse Coughlin soft-soaped the mayor, pledging his support for a price. You take the fair now, Mr. Mayor. I ain't on a single fair committee. I'm used to meeting people down here in the First, and I ought to be on some of them reception committees. I'll see that you get on some committees, Harrison replied. I welcome your support. As the New York press trumpeted the view that Chicago would put on a cattle show on the shores of Lake Michigan, the Honorable John Bathhouse Coughlin took his turn at Central Station, greeting visitors from around the world. The business elite was dealt a further blow when a monument to the anarchists was unveiled. The next day, Governor John Peter Altgeld pardoned the 3 who were in prison and denounced the trial. No matter how fanatical their beliefs, Altgeld said, no greater damage could possibly threaten our institutions than to have the courts of justice run wild or to give way to popular clamor. The pardon made Altgeld the most hated man in America. The press charged him with encouraging anarchy. The Tribune attacked his German birth. He does not reason like an American, nor feel like one, and consequently does not behave like one. On May 1st, 1893, Chicago's elite offered the world what they wanted the world to see. $200,000 people were on hand when President Grover Cleveland opened the fair. The fair's buildings were temporary structures coated with plaster. Called the White City, it was the businessmen's idea of civic order. White, clean, and safe. Everything Chicago was not.
It's an imaging thing. The fair is an imaging thing. Chicago hated this image of the black city, the city of smoke and soot and dirt and pollution and gambling houses and whatever. So the idea is you bring them into the first-class hotels. And Olmsted set this up beautifully. They would take excursion boats from downtown and sweep across the magnificent skyline and land at the fair and take a movable sidewalk and go into the Court of Honor, and here's the new Chicago. It provided just the things to settle, I think, the nerves a little bit after Haymarket.
This utopian world was reflected by the fair's official photography. All is orderly, the weather perfect. People lifeless.
They presented pictures of these European-like boulevards, canals with gondolas and gondoliers escorting elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen. It was presented as an upper-middle-class festival, safe, clean, lots of music, lots of art.
My parents spoke about the World's Fair with the greatest enthusiasm and interest. It made a tremendous impression on them. My mother was 17 and my father was 31. They spoke about the Palace of Fine Arts. They had the idea that this was the greatest art in the world that was brought to Chicago for the World's Fair. They talked about a painting breaking home ties of a young boy leaving home to go to work. That was the experience of my father.
The fair's architecture reflected not the innovation that inspired the new downtown, but classical Greece and Rome.
The fair certainly was orthodoxy in action. That is, it said, we admire what you have done and we can reproduce it only on an even better and grander scale. For Americans like Sullivan, this represented a defeat rather than a victory for native traditions, and in that sense you could argue the fair was a defeat.
Louis Sullivan was in despair. The fair, he wrote, set American architecture back 50 years. George Pullman was ecstatic. He ran special trains so fairgoers could visit his utopian town.
The town became almost a part of the World's Fair of 1893. It was Epcot, the Epcot of that time. Epcot meaning Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, with hot and cold water in the homes and bathrooms and paved streets and trees and flowers and things like that. And people stayed overnight to more fully enjoy it. But they never really talked to the people.
Those who looked beneath the surface at Pullman found that all was not well.
Pullman owns everything. You can't own your own home in Pullman. Pullman managers can enter your house and tell your wife that the kitchen is painted the wrong color, that the curtains clash with the decor that is expected of a Pullman house. The Pullman manager can come in and say, Mrs. Jones, you have a very dirty kitchen. We will force you to move unless you do this, that, and that. And you can be evicted. So the man has lost control over even his private life.
A writer for Harper's came to the unavoidable conclusion that the idea of Pullman is un-American. It is benevolent, well-wishing feudalism.
The fair is America's window into the future. Fairs generally function as this. It is a place where people put out outlandish ideas which can, in a sense, be trial balloons as to whether or not they're going to work in society as a whole. One of the most important for the Columbian Exposition was the many uses of electricity. You have an all-electric kitchen, you have electric lighting, electric elevators, electricity doing almost every kind of job in the factory or in the home. That's a very advanced idea for a lot of people.
The lights illuminating the court of honor at night impressed Hilda Satt, the young immigrant from Poland. She called them a sudden vision of heaven.
She was about 10 at the time. That was the first time she'd ever seen electric lights. It was like magic to her, just thrilling. She never forgot it.
At the mile-long Midway, fairgoers delighted in Pittsburgh bridge designer George Ferris's 250-foot-high wheel. It was his response to the fair's challenge to outdo the Eiffel Tower, the chief exhibit of the Paris World's Fair. workers pushed the wonders of a young escape artist. And international beauties. Immigrants who could not afford to return to Europe found a piece of home. There were exhibits from cultures all over the world.
People said that basically this was wonderful. I mean, you created kind of a human museum. Maybe the natives of those countries learned more about Americans, and people in Western Europe learned more about those natives.
My mother spoke about the month of September. She said the Africans from Dahomey were suffering terribly from the chill in September, and the Eskimos who were there were suffering from the heat.
To civil rights leader Frederick Douglass, it was racist. The fair presented no accomplishments of more than 8 million black Americans, Douglass charged. Only African savages brought here to act the monkey. As a marketing device, the fair held special days for various ethnic groups: Germans, Poles, Irish, Bohemians. There was also a Colored People's Day. Douglass helped organize it. Ida B. Wells, his young militant friend, boycotted the day as racist. Douglass used it as a pulpit. "We Negroes love our country," he thundered. "We fought for it. We ask only that we be treated as well as those who fought against it."
She was very critical of Frederick Douglass, but she relented after the event to say, "I think I was wrong. A more mature, a seasoned civil rights veteran knew how to take advantage of an opportunity."
Tens of thousands of African Americans from across the country attended the fair.
They not only enjoyed listening to great speakers of their group and other groups, for example, at the World Parliament of Religion or the Congress of Representative Women, but they toured the fairgrounds looking at the different exhibits from around the world, and they thoroughly enjoyed themselves.
Bertha Palmer, as head of the board of lady managers, insisted on a separate building, celebrating the accomplishments of women. A woman designed it. Bertha Palmer was not only the most powerful woman at the fair, but Chicago's hostess to the world.
There's a great story, the Infanta of Spain came to represent her brother, the king, at the Columbian Exposition.
The Infanta was staying at the Palmer House in one of the nicest suite of rooms in what was an extraordinarily elegant hotel.
She received an invitation from the Queen Bee of Chicago, Bertha Palmer, who's the hostess to the World's Fair, to join her for dinner at this sumptuous mansion up on Lakeshore Drive.
And when the Infanta found out that Mrs. Palmer, who lived in the castle, was the wife of the man that owned the hotel she was staying in, she decided not to go to the thing.
She asked with a scowl, "Am I to have dinner with the wife of my innkeeper?"
The Spanish ambassador told her she had to make an appearance, so she showed up for a very short time, and she snubbed Mrs. Palmer.
Came late, left early.
Bertha Palmer got her revenge in 1899, when America had gone to war with Spain. She refused an invitation to a reception in Paris for the Infanta. "I cannot have dinner," she replied curtly, with the bibulous representative of a degenerate monarch.
And so Bertha had her revenge.
The fair was a smashing success. New York's Harper's Weekly called it the greatest event in the history of the country since the Civil War. It drew 27 million people, 14 million from abroad, the greatest tourist attraction in American history. On October 28th, 2 days before the fair closed, Carter Harrison welcomed America's mayors to the White City. When the fire swept over our city and laid it in ashes, he boasted, the world said, Chicago and its boasting is now gone forever. But Chicago said, we will rebuild the city better than ever. And Chicago has done it. 2 years ago, this 1,000 acres covered by these palaces was the home of the muskrat. Look at it now. He invited the mayors to come out of this white city into our black city. Then he went home, to be summoned to his door a few hours later. Summoned by a half-mad illiterate, rejected for work at City Hall. Harrison's funeral was the most impressive in the young city's history. 200,000 mourners paid their respects in City Hall. The procession to Graceland Cemetery was led by Chicago's titans of industry. Next came the aldermen. And then Harrison's supporters. Irish, German, Polish, Bohemian, Italian, Greek, policemen, union leaders, and socialists.
There's this tremendous outpouring for Harrison as this unifying type of figure. Just what the city needed, because everyone was saying at the time, these industrial cities, the scourge of the land, and they're flying apart as fast as they're being built up. And they're filled with anarchists and socialists and unacceptable aliens, and is this the American future? And Harrison was the guy in Chicago that could cool that kind of stuff down.
The next July, a reporter looked up the tracks and witnessed another dark moment for the Black City. A strike at Pullman had led to a national railway strike. When this sidelined trains carrying the U.S. mail, President Cleveland dispatched federal troops. 34 people died in Chicago's bloodiest labor uprising. The Presidential Commission was critical of George Pullman. In the terrible Depression of 1893, he had slashed wages, but not rents. Some paychecks were as little as 12 cents. He guaranteed his stockholders an 8% return.
Even the U.S. commissioners suggested that he wasn't really playing by the rules of open capitalism, which claimed that the reason that investors were supposed to get a profit is because they took a risk. And the commissioners came to the point of view of the workers, which was, where's the risk? They're not taking any risk. They've got a guaranteed 8% dividend, rain or shine, whereas the workers are having to take a big hit during this very tough times, and in fact, suffering from starvation as a result of this.
Renowned the world over as a symbol of social responsibility, the town of Pullman was considered by the Illinois Supreme Court an agent of social control. The court forced the company to divest it, and Pullman was absorbed by Chicago. An elusive utopia became an ordinary industrial town. Within a generation, the Florence Hotel, named after Pullman's beloved daughter, was a whorehouse. George Pullman's Corinthian column in Graceland Cemetery is remarkable for its beauty and its weight. When he died broken-hearted in 1897, his casket was enshrouded in tons of reinforced cement to prevent desecration by labor activists. George Pullman had tried to speak to Chicago's labor problem, the big issue of the age, through social engineering, and failed. Others in the 1890s planted seeds of labor and social reform. In the hard soil of 19th century capitalism, they bore no fruit. Writer Henry Demarest Lloyd championed labor unions and the 8-hour day, to no avail. He railed against the unfairness of Haymarket Judge Joseph Gary and tried, without success, to prevent his re-election in 1893. Married to the daughter of William Bross, publisher of the Tribune, Lloyd was dropped from clubs, snubbed by patrician friends, and disinherited. Florence Kelley, a socialist firebrand, changed the agenda of Hull House. She convinced Jane Addams the poor would be better served by social change, not tea parties.
Kelley is urging her to get out of Hull House. Instead of having people come to Hull House, you've got to go into the neighborhoods, and you've got to expose first. Because people have to know how horrid conditions are and how extensive these horrific conditions are in the city. And the only way we can do that is publicity. And we have to do it with hard statistics. This is the age of science and statistics and the beginnings of social science. So she urged these social science techniques of surveying and map making, and in this way, alert a nation and try to prick the conscience of a nation.
When Hull House finished its elaborate survey of the near West Side, it had a hard time finding a publisher who could handle the 14 color codes that identified each ethnic group crammed in its tenements. A vast number of families, it found, had incomes of $5 or less a week. The first systematic study of a working-class neighborhood in America, the survey brought fame to Hull House. It called attention to the near West Side, but little changed. Kelley wrote a searing report on sweatshops, which led to an Illinois law for an 8-hour day for women and children, and banned child labor under 14. She was appointed Illinois' first factory inspector. Some parents bribed employers to hire their children, who provided 1/3 of their income. Although the Illinois Supreme Court overruled the factory labor law as an infringement on property rights, it would become in future decades a model of a new liberalism.
Before this period of time, reform was associated with getting corrupt politicians from the lower classes out of office and putting the quote-unquote best men in their place. Now, you began to get a new kind of reform, which is much more closely associated with modern liberalism of the 20th century variety. In fact, this period of time is really the birth of that whole approach.
The winter after the fair closed, arsonists burned the remains of a decaying white city. It seemed to symbolize the illusion of the urban ideal. Ida B. Wells, Chicago's problems were overshadowed by possibilities. She found a haven she could not have found in the South for her campaign for civil rights. She remained after the fair. In coming decades, Black Americans would follow her, migrating from the South by the tens of thousands in search of work. They came because they saw in Chicago not problems, they saw opportunity. Like the Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, Bohemians, Poles, Russians, Jews, and Lithuanians before them, and the Yankee speculators before them, and the French explorers who first saw the potential of the stinking river by the Portage.
There's more about Chicago on American Experience Online. Take a Chicago Trivia Challenge. Spend a day in the life of Jane